Welcome.
Thank you so much. Let's see if oh, perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for having us. We're excited to answer some questions and really get into the weeds of the gut microbiome and IBS, SIBO, and beyond.
All right. Well, we're excited to hear what you guys have to say. So before we go ahead and get started, why don't you fill in the audience on a little bit about you, I guess how you came to this and what you've been doing the last 5, 10 years on this journey that you're on.
Yeah, oh my gosh, where to begin? I mean, overall, I'll say, and I'll let Dahlia speak for herself a little bit, but really for me and even Dahlia, we were our own patients first and foremost. Like we were sick, standard American children moving into sick, standard American adults. Just I was riddled with disease, and Dahlia even more so than me. We just found ourselves searching, and in that search, we were like, oh, registered dietitian's kind of like a food doctor. And so we became registered dietitians. And then even with that, where we were working, I started out in public health and I was realizing, my gosh, there's so much red tape. My thought was like, if we get the right policies, people will just follow those policies and it'll be great. It'll be sunshine and rainbows. But you come to find out all the politics and the money and the red tape, and you're like, oh my gosh. So we were constantly searching and really it was like we need to open up our own practice. And that's where Mary's Health came from. It's integrative practice. We get to spend time with our patients. We get to dive deep. And really on that journey, we dove into the gut microbiome because we're constantly looking for, okay, well, why? So if you're bloated or if you have high blood sugar or if you have cancer or autoimmune disease, why? Why? So in asking why to each of those diseases or each thing we came across, we ultimately, what we feel is the nexus, which is the root for pretty much everything in this world, is the microbiome, right? So that's why we're so passionate. We really love it. And you can
And
add to that.
yeah, we've been on this journey professionally for over a decade and just
Yeah.
personally now for, a few decades. And we've just seen incredible transformative healing within ourselves, within thousands, literally thousands and thousands of
Our
people
patients.
who we've served both one-on-one in our programs. So we are just grateful to be here with this opportunity, doing this work and just helping people heal with each meal. That really is just our mission at the end of the day.
All right, great. So let's get started. So first, how has this what seems to be relatively new understanding of the microbiome, it kind of came out of nowhere where all of a sudden it just became the hottest topic in health. How is that understanding of the microbiome changed our understanding of health?
We've really, since it's been about the mid 90s that we really started understanding, okay, we're cutting out fat, we're cutting out sugar. It's not necessarily making the hugest impact on heart disease, obesity rates, metabolic conditions. We were trying to manipulate just what we could control, saturated fat intake, refined carbohydrate intake. And we were starting to see there were other factors that were contributing to it. So since the mid 90s, we've really understood, we have all these microbes. We are more microbial DNA than human DNA. These probably are influencing our health in some way, shape, or form. And that's when they started the Human Microbiome Project, where they started mapping the microbiome to really understand, okay, who's living in the gut and what are their roles and what are their functions. And here we are, almost 30 years later, and we're still not sure. We've mapped the colon. We've really understood a lot more about the colon microbiome, but the small intestine has its own microbiome that they're actually still investing in understanding a little bit further the functionality. We're such complex beings as humans as is. So then to understand that whole nother layer of how the microbes and how complex they are and how they intertwine with our own DNA and bodily functions is just so, so, so important. So it's exciting. We've been in this gut space, gut sphere for, the better part of the last decade. And so it's been exciting to see, oh, wow, other people care about it. And they're really starting to understand it does really matter.
And I'll just add to that, like the everyday person has to understand the delay, but luckily with technology, there's
Mhm.
less of a delay, I think. But typically research, or I would say the guidelines that come out, or especially like food companies and whether it's government bodies or other organizations giving recommendations, that's delayed by about 10 to 15 years. It's a behind, you know what I mean? So there's 10 to 15 years of research going on that maybe is different, but by the time those guidelines come out, we're about 10, 15 years delayed on that. So it feels like the microbiome came out of nowhere, but that's just that delay. And luckily, I think, the good and bad of social media and technology, the good is that now you have you're able to have a direct connection. We're able to have the real truth about health. We're able to do these conferences online. We're able to speak directly to communities. So you're hearing maybe research that won't actually come out in guidelines for another 5 to 10 years, but you're hearing it from practitioners who are implementing it in their practice today, right? And that's really speaks to the innovation of our technology and the research. We hopefully are going to just kind of shorten that delay over time, and that's the key.
And one thing I like to always say is, we should use research to expand and not contract, right? Because today's pseudoscience is the next decade's guidelines. So I think with the microbiome, we're really learning that where, in less than 5 years ago, we were hearing practitioners say leaky gut is just what functional medicine people say. And, those crazy naturopaths are talking about it and it's not real. And now we're saying, oh, actually it is. We've coined it intestinal hyperpermeability, but it is in fact a real thing. So, in the gut microbiome, I think it's so important to continue to keep an open mind because you don't know what you don't know. So to kind of have practitioners who are very quick to say, no, pseudoscience, not proven, not evidence-based, not in the guidelines, it's always saying, yes, not yet. However, there is emerging research and we need to consider it and be open to it.
Right. That sounds very familiar with the idea of like Ayurvedic for, I don't know, thousands of years. It's been talking about inflammation as the root of disease. And it was very much poo-pooed and looked at just, magic and voodoo basically. And now Western medicine is like, oh, look what we've discovered. It's the root of disease. So
Right.
is the microbiome, I hear, and I might be blind because of the circles that I run in, but has it become widely accepted that the microbiome is really at the heart or close to it of the way that our body works in general?
I don't know if I would say it's been fully accepted, but you do have like the American call it
College of
yeah,
Gastroenterology.
College of Gastroenterology really coming out with now guidelines for the microbiome and speaking to the microbiome and probiotics. So I feel like practitioners, as long as they're staying up to date, are going, oh wow, like this is here, this is a thing. I don't know if as strongly as we come out and going like the gut microbiome is the nexus of all health on the planet, like we truly believe that. And we are spreading the message of like, if you care for any ecosystem, first and foremost, it should be your inner ecosystem, which is your gut microbiome. Think of it like you're carrying this terrarium, and it is the most important ecosystem because your dietary habits, your choices, your tastes, your likes shape and diffuse out into larger ecosystems, right? And that's many spheres and many influences. So I don't know. I wouldn't say the mainstream is quite there yet, but I think they will be. They'll finally get it. Because really, I mean, logically it makes sense, right? When you're caring for the smallest creature, you're caring for all creatures by default. So if you think of the bacteria, archaea, fungi, all these beautiful, really microorganisms that are live and living in us, wow, it's pretty amazing. If you care for them, they care for you, and it just ripples outward.
So you during one of your comments, you had mentioned that about the small intestine, they're kind of figuring out the microbiome and in the small intestine. Should we be looking at these different areas of bacteria? Like there's the oral microbiome, there's the gut microbiome, and then I guess there's the small intestine microbiome, and then there's the microbiome on our skin. Should we be looking at it as individual things, kind of like we have historically looked at organs, or should we be looking at it more holistically, that this is really just one microbiome and may even transcend our body because we know that even the people around us affect our microbiome? Or should we be looking at it as that you have this distinct microbiome that's completely just that's completely different than the next one over?
I think a great analogy for that is like the Colorado River or the Amazon River, right? I think when you look at these huge rivers and you can almost think of our GI tract as a massive river that runs through our entire body, and you have these rivers that run through multiple or even single huge continents. Along that river, you will have different ecosystems. So it's the same river, but one area is more hot and dry, another area is more tropical, another area is more dense and thick with overgrowth. It's the same river. It's just running through different ecosystems. And I think that's how we need to think about the GI tract. It's the same GI tract, but correct. The oral microbiome is very different than the stomach microbiome. It's very different than the small intestinal microbiome, the large intestine. And for the most part, we are testing the large intestine. Stool samples and stool testing is really showing you the large intestine. It's not always giving you a clear picture of the small intestine.
But we do know they'll influence one another. For
Right.
example, strep throat. We think, oh, that's an oral microbiome isolated thing. Not necessarily true, because we do tend to see those who have had recurrent strep throat also test positive for strep, even in their colon microbiome. So they will communicate with one another. These microbes will what's called translocate, and they will kind of float down the river
Yeah,
and
they'll
float
get
to
on a
other
little
areas.
raft and like I'm migrating a little bit.
Yes. So, we do see, okay, that strep isn't just causing tonsillitis and, tonsil stones. It's also decreasing the pH in the small intestine and the colon and enabling yeast overgrowth. And, there's ripple effects there as well. So they absolutely can influence one another. And we tend to find if you are having dysbiosis that originated in one of the microbiomes, for example, maybe you picked up a really strong gastroenteritis, maybe you picked up norovirus. That can sometimes then offset the balance in the bladder microbiome, the vaginal microbiome, the skin microbiome. So they do all communicate with one another and really can impact one another. I think the gut more so than the others, but the others can still impact the gut.
And so I have to paint the picture again, just so it's great when people understand is like we put a dam in this river and people just start, we make a dam and then we come to find out, oh my gosh, the salmon aren't spawning. Oh, where we put the dam, there's more flooding. And now there's more, let's say, crocodiles and other things. And so that's very much like our internal microbiome is where once you change something, and this could be you had a surgery, you had a baby, you took antibiotics, right? You put something that really wasn't there originally, like a dam, and now you're seeing this change. It's not really the microbes' fault. It's just those crocodiles are going to take advantage of this new space. Those salmon who no longer can swim downstream like they were are not going to spawn downstream. And you're left then with those ripple effects of going, oh man, those other species that like to eat the salmon or intermingled with the salmon can no longer do that. Now there's gaps where other opportunists take over, right? Just like we see that in the larger macro ecosystem, we see that in the smaller micro ecosystem. And that's where we have patients who are like, I have fungal overgrowth, I have SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and it just kind of continues from there.
So what I'd like to do is take one step back, and why
Mhm.
don't you tell everybody exactly what is the microbiome?
Yeah.
That
Mm.
microbiome. What processes that we know currently that it takes out, and then how does it impact our overall health?
Yeah, so I would say the microbiota is the correct term when we're talking about all the little cool critters, right? We call them like whether we call them gut buggies or microbes, whatever you want to call them, but the microbiota will encompass all the bacteria, fungi, archaea, protozoa, even parasites and things like that. We do have a parasitome and a virome. Viruses aren't really included in that. They have like their own separate virome. But when we add the ome to the end of it, like the microbiome, virome, parasitome, that's not including the actual species, but also their byproducts and their genetics. So that ome is really signifying like the effects of this huge and very powerful population. So just to clarify kind of those definitions a little bit. And then the impact of that is quite significant. And that's what we're still continuing to find out more and more about, where I think even right now, like we're hearing a lot about parasites and parasite cleanses, and we're hearing still a lot about colonics and colon cleanses and all these things, but we have to understand the bacteria help to balance the parasites. The parasites also help to balance viruses, and viruses help to balance bacteria. And when we try to eradicate one, or we don't really know what we're doing, and we're constantly doing cleanse after cleanse after cleanse, we are disrupting the ecosystem. It's very much like, a lot of people, I would say, don't like rats, but that doesn't mean we should kill all the rats in the world, right? They serve a purpose and a function. It's only when we start to leave garbage cans out, or, we're leaving our big dumpsters open, yeah, you're going to get more rats, right? You're creating an environment for the rats, and they're going to thrive
And breed.
And then you have the byproducts of that. Very, very similar to what's happening in our gut microbiome. It is the actual species, and then the byproducts of that, what they're making, how they're contributing. And this can get pretty deep, where we're also sharing genetics with some of these microbes, right? So we're not just getting the benefit of these guys living inside of us, they're also eating our food, interacting with food DNA, and interacting with our own DNA via bacterial viruses, human viruses, food viruses. A lot of people don't even know those exist. Like, wait, you mean bacteria have their own viruses? Food has their own viruses, and human has their own viruses that are intermingling, and that's pretty amazing and kind of crazy when you think about it.
And because we have such a wide variety of different types of bugs, some can be what's called commensal or helpful, and can do things like create byproducts that decrease inflammation, that repair the lining of the gut, that decrease cholesterol, that can help with metabolism in the endocrine system, can help with kidney function. So there's well-documented data that these can have positive influences. When they are positive bugs, they can have positive influences. And of course, on the other side, these more opportunistic bugs can have more inflammatory effects, and they can then have deleterious effects in the cardiovascular system, the endocrine system, the metabolic system, and all of these other systems, throughout the entire body. So I always encourage people, if they can come to me and they say, I don't know why I have insulin resistance. I'm plant-based and I exercise and I'm managing my stress. What's happening with your gut? Is your gut offset? Because that can then communicate those inflammatory signals to your endocrine system that can block insulin receptors, that can increase internal stress, even if you're working on mental, emotional stress, and that can offset the hormones that will impact insulin levels. So I really do believe in it. I'm clearly have a bias because it's my favorite subject. But I truly believe that the microbiome is going to influence our entire body tip to toe.
So you mentioned parasites, and there's a lot of fear online, like everybody has these parasites, and I was talking to Dr. Pam Popper, and she's like, what river are you alongside of that you're swimming, swimming in, and in the Amazon, that you're worried about all these crazy, exotic parasites? How, and what, based on what you were saying, it sounded like there are parasites in our body, but they're just sort of part of this microbiome, that they're part of the a diverse culture within our body. Are parasites, for the average person, something we should be concerned about?
I would say for the average person, no. It's an extreme rarity. There are cases, like I've had patients who've come to me and they're like, I'm a missionary by profession, so I've traveled to every single continent and, had dysentery and all these different conditions. Of course, that person's more likely to have a parasite than someone who's never traveled outside of the United States. So, I think it's trendy right now to sell parasite cleanses. You have lots of influencers who promote parasite cleanses. I will say I've had 10 times more people come to me being harmed by a parasite cleanse because they never confirmed that they in fact had a parasite, than people who actually have a confirmed parasite, who can either do traditional Western testing and test positive for stool, ova, and parasites, or even if they've done more of a functional test and do come back positive for some type of parasite. It's an extreme rarity. It's ordinarily, and I've only seen it really in a handful of my own patients, but it's either someone who does a lot of international travel, normal. Or I've had one patient who worked in a lab with parasites. This was part of what she did day to day for work, and she ended up testing positive for a parasite. So it is very rare. I think you see it online, and I think people are confused because you see, I just saw this the other day. An influencer was posting, she was doing a parasite cleanse and coffee enemas, and she was showing them. And she was saying, look at these ropeworms that I'm excreting from my body. And that's not a parasite. It's when you're, shooting coffee up your rectum, it's your mucus barrier that's getting sloughed off. So these are pieces of mucus that are normal parts of our gut. These are not worms that you're releasing. So in my experience, parasites are quite rare. And again, usually there is some type of contributing factor to it. You're not really going to just pick up a parasite by going out to eat somewhere here, because we have pretty strict regulations on our food system. Not that it's impossible, it's just unlikely.
And I will add, like, if you are concerned about parasites, because it can freak you out. Like, what do you mean? I have a parasitome in my body. Like, I have parasites in me right now, and like probably like we travel quite a bit. I probably do have parasites, but if I'm concerned, I would say then double down, because really the connection. This was in a recent study, and we also know a really cool gastro who's doing some great innovative research on this, but we are lacking lactobacillus in the US population to where, so I don't even, I mean, there's some preliminary research coming out, which is really measuring the lactobacillus in human stool, and it's not looking good for the study size and the sampling going. Like, there's been some samples where people have 0 lactobacillus in their stool. We're going like, whoa, this is alarming, because what lactobacillus does is it does create some lactic acid in certain environments. So in the right environment, lactobacillus is going to help. That lactic acid, guess who doesn't like lactic acid? Parasites, right? So the lactobacillus, one of its main functions is to create an environment that parasites do not like to be in. So if you're getting that lactobacillus, if you're creating that balanced ecosystem in that environment, the parasites, even if they come in, whether it's an egg or a full-blown parasite, and you have this healthy, robust gut microbiome full of lactobacillus, it's going to go, ugh, I'm out of here. And then you poo and you're done with it, right? For the most part. So it's important to kind of understand that context as well.
And whether it's at the entrance or the exit, because, say you do consume undercooked sushi or, undercooked meat. We've all seen those gross videos of people showing like salmon at Costco is,
Some
riddled with
questionable-
parasites.
Yeah.
Your stomach acid is really going to take care of them for the most part. You could have low stomach acid. But if your stomach acid doesn't kill it off, your next level is bile acids, which are very acidic. But again, you could have issues with your liver, your gallbladder.
But I think
So
that's
then
really
the lactobacillus is
pause
going to
on
be.
that though too, because that's what, so how many Americans are on PPIs?
Mhm.
How many Americans have their gallbladder removed? So when we are kind of, again, these are the dams we're putting up, right? Where we're kind of manipulating this ecosystem a little bit too much without realizing the downstream effects. And so you're on PPIs, you're not eating enough lactobacillus, you removed your gallbladder, and now you're like, man, I got parasites. And now you're stuck with parasites. So it's like you have to understand the context.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, there are things you can do if you suspect you have a parasite. You can test for parasites. And usually if you have a parasite, you have severe symptoms when the parasite enters your body. It's not like, oh, I have some rectal itching and there's a whole colony, a whole family living in there. It's usually you have abdominal cramps, nausea, bloody stool. Your body's going to try to let you know something's wrong. Please help me.
So, and all right, so moving on from parasites, because it's sound like it's a parasite question. No, not like not in a bad way. I wanted to kind of put a break in there because I wanted to talk about this, something that's been popular for many years now are colonics, where people wash out their colon essentially, either with I guess it's a coffee enema, but they there's all this idea that we need to wash out our colon, that there's all this patch stuff in there. We had Dr. Furman on early today, and he said, and he does all these sigmoidoscopies, I believe it's called. And, he's done like thousands of them, and he said there's nothing on the walls. Like that's not really how it works. What are your thoughts on colonics? Is that something where it's just a craze that takes off in it, and it logically makes sense, but it's not backed up by the science. What are your thoughts on colonics? Are there any benefits? Are there any harms?
I, just for general gut health purposes, am not a big proponent of colonics. I think for a few reasons. One, if you're regularly doing them, then your body is always looking to preserve energy somewhere. So it then will become reliant on you having something external evacuate your bowels. And I've seen this happen to patients where then they say, I couldn't poop anymore on my own. I had to do colonics in order to keep going. So if our body can preserve energy, it absolutely will preserve energy. And it can also confuse the nerves because, that river analogy that James was giving, a river is flowing in one direction, unidirectional. So we have nerves and muscles and tissue that helps that happen, that peristalsis and that movement. Now, if you're suddenly shooting something up the opposite way, that's going to confuse the nerve signals. And so that also can then long-term cause more damage. So you don't want to really be investing in these short-term gains for long-term damage. The other risk with it is if you are using coffee or other heated liquids, you can have an internal burn. So you can actually damage the tissue. And then if the pressure is too high, then that can actually sometimes push open what's called the ileocecal valve, the little door that separates your large intestine from your small intestine. You have 100 times more almost microbial diversity in the colon than you have in the small intestine. You really don't have a lot going on in the small intestine because you don't want them there. You want to digest and absorb there. So if now you have this liquid shooting up, shooting the door open, you're introducing all these bugs into the small intestine. So I've also had people come to me having caused SIBO because they're going to colon hydrotherapy or they're, self-doing coffee enemas. And again, in this colon hydrotherapy, it seems like it's working because you see this little glass box and you're like, wow, look at that worm that just left my body. Look at that, whatever it is, you're sloughing off your mucus barrier because again, you shouldn't have this liquid aggressively washing through that very delicate mucus. So yes, you might have a little bit of stool that washes out, but hopefully you're naturally having a daily detox. You're having a bowel movement at least once a day. And if that's the case, then you're not in need of these things. I usually tend to see it in very extreme cases. And my goal is always to say, how can we get you going on your own? Because we need to get you off of these colonics as soon as possible.
And if you're doing a colonic, just ask why. Why are you doing this colonic? And just continue to ask why. If the answer is, well, I don't poo, it takes me 2 days, 3 days. We have patients who go once a week. There's people who go even less than that. And the answer is why. And so it's like, why are you constipated, right? Why are you not having a bowel movement? And I think that's the important question to answer. It's not really because you need a colonic. I mean, it can help, right? You're going to feel better after the colonic, but again, you have to assess the return on investment, right? Like the ROI of that is not good long term, right? So it's asking why, I think, is the better question for sure.
So in one of the books I had read, the doctor was talking about how most Americans are actually constipated and don't realize it, and that their movement and they think because they go every day that they don't have a problem, but it's actually taking them 3 days for food to go through their body. Can you talk about why that is and what the health ramifications are of that?
Yes. So it's so important not just to ask, am I going every day, but to also ask, do I feel complete when I get up? Am I straining when I am going? What are they looking like? Do I feel like there was more in there that didn't emerge? What is the texture of the stool? So there's so much to really ask yourself, not just, yep, checked it off the box, move on, because you could be retaining quite a bit of stool. The normal motility time and motility period is 14 to 32 hours. So that should be more or less the time that, from the time you ingest something to the time it comes out, You should see that. And you can even test this at home. You can take a handful of either corn or sesame seeds, roughly chew them, try not to chew them too well so they don't get broken down too much, and then time how long it takes for you to see them on the other end. This will tell you more or less your motility time. So absolutely, if it's 3 days later, if it's, 4 days later, you are not fully evacuating, you're not fully emptying, and that's probably why you feel bloated or you have reflux or you have these other symptoms. They're not unique and occurring on their own for the most part. They could be, but usually people are, for lack of fiber, for lack of hydration, lack of movement, stress, we tend to be a constipated society. If we know that less than 5% of Americans are consuming the low fiber recommendations, then a very small percent, less than 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy, it's unlikely, most Americans are getting in that movement, that nutrition, that hydration, that sleep that helps regulate our motility and all the other things that are needed to have that just really good, complete daily evacuation.
So if we had optimal health and we ate some corn, how long would be the ideal amount of time before we saw that corn again?
14 to 32 hours. You should see it in that time period. So from the time, if you eat it at 5 p.m., you should be seeing it 14 to 32 hours after that time.
Okay. All right. Great. And I think this was an interesting thing, and I'll let you speak to it. That certain things like fiber doesn't get digested by the body. That is that's one of the defining characteristics. And yet fiber is so important to us. If we're not digesting the fiber ourselves, why is fiber important to us? I'm setting
Right.
answer, so
I mean, we go as far as to say, how we have essential amino acids, essential fatty acids. Fiber is the essential carbohydrate, right? We don't really hear about the essential carbohydrate. There's been some studies on that, and they're like, oh, we don't know if we can call it that yet. We call it that. Like we feel like there's enough evidence to call it that because we don't make fiber, right? We have to get fiber from outside, just like that's why we call it essential. And so why is that? If we're not even absorbing the fiber, we're not plants, right? We don't have cellulose in our body that we're making. So it's like, why is it so important? Again, like you're alluding to, this, the microbes eat the fiber, right? And that's what we're calling prebiotics. That's what we're feeding our microbes. So really, yeah, it's really insane that we know we have this microbiome. We know we need to feed it. What does it like to eat? Fiber, right? The beans, peas, legumes, nuts, seeds, fruits, vegetables, right? All these wonderful fiber-rich foods are not just feeding you, they're feeding your microbes. And that's even more the case when we're talking about flavonoids and these polyphenols and these colors.
Antioxidants.
The antioxidants, why they're antioxidants is because first and foremost, the bacteria is taking the color, let's call it the flavonoid and the pigmentation, and transforming it into an antioxidant for you, right? You're not going to do that yourself. It's your microbiome that's going to do that for you, or your microbiota. So,
and I think when people think fiber, they think, okay, I need more celery and I need more roughage and apples and kale. And yes, absolutely, those are helpful. You do want some of that insoluble fiber. Certain microbes really love that rough, dense fiber for them to chew on. And you do also need a lot of insoluble starchy type of carbohydrate and starchy type of fiber because one, that draws water into the intestines, it hydrates the stool. And we do know that the microbes make the highest amount of postbiotics, right? Those byproducts that these bugs are making through starch. So there have been studies that have shown some of the foods that are most helpful for making those short chain fatty acids, those postbiotics, those byproducts are things like potato starch in particular. So that's that resistant starch that we get when we bake a bunch of potatoes and then throw them in the refrigerator and they create that little film on top of them. That resistant starch is a favorite food for your gut bugs. We find that in things like green bananas or green banana flour. Overnight oats are really rich in that, or white rice. Sometimes if you make a pot of white rice, you let it cool down, or maybe you ran out of time, you have to just stick the pot in the refrigerator, and there's this little film all around the pot. that's what emerges from the grains or the starches when they've gone under certain conditions. That is actually really rich for your microbes. So if you see that film there, eat it. You don't want to scrape it off. Your gut bugs really want to be consuming that. So these starchy foods like beans and things that people cut out of their diet because they're harder to digest, your bugs need those. You need to feed your healthy bugs. So it's so important to feed those bugs. If it's not for us, it's for them.
So I read a post on social media, recently, and they were talking about, oh, you want to stay away from starch. Why is starch so vilified when the research suggests that starch is so essential for the microbiome and the microbiome is so important for our health?
Well, I think first and foremost, the starch in the context of, especially in the US, I think we think of French fries and we think of like the cornstarch that's an additive in a lot of the processed foods, and we think of just hyper processed starch. And I think so. First and foremost, those who are maybe, and this was me like early on, like in my high school bodybuilder phase, thinking I knew everything about nutrition, and you're thinking like, yeah, low carb, and I just want to build muscle and look good, and you're thinking starch bad, carbs bad, lots of energy. And it's true. I mean, carbohydrates do have energy, and you have to be, we're not saying to consume a whole meal of just white rice, right? It's definitely about balance. And so I think in the context of that, when you're used to the standard American diet, or when you're kind of just first waking up from it and trying to be healthier, it's easy to vilify carbohydrates because you're like, man, they've been making me sick this whole time. Oh, it's the white rice and potatoes, negating the fact or forgetting the fact that you also eat a hyper processed diet, right? So
Oh,
yeah.
and I think we're of a society of instant gratification, right? Starch is going to absorb water. So after you've eaten a very starchy meal, you're also retaining more water than if you eat just a very high protein, non-starchy meal. So I think then people say, oh, it makes me gain weight so quickly. It's water weight. You're gonna lose that water weight once your gastrointestinal tract breaks apart the starch. And so, yeah, I think for that reason, and the fact that now people are wearing CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, and they're like, that starch makes my blood sugar go up so high. We don't have good data on showing what that even means. If you have an initial spike, there's no data to say, oh, that's really bad. It's just how you recover from the spike within a 2-hour period after your meal. So I think for that reason, if people are like, instantly my blood sugar goes up, instantly within the day I gain weight, starch bad, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that. We need to have more long-term understanding of the topic and just balance, right? I think any of these fear-based thought processes just aren't balanced thinking. So of course, don't eat only starch, but also don't completely cut out the starch.
Yeah.
So you kind of hit on the point of these tools that we're wearing and all this information that we're having is simplifying our understanding of what's going on outside of a context of what's actually going on. So you see a peak, but you don't recognize that when you eat certain things like plant-based things, that if you have a spike, it will go up and then go down slowly over time and not go too far below baseline, if at all.
Mm-hmm.
How else have you seen the simplification of nutrition? People think they know what they're talking about, like a high school bodybuilder, right?
Yeah.
And how does that negatively impact our health?
In
Ooh.
so many ways.
Yeah.
I think we're always looking for just the next gimmick, the next quick fix, whether that was a few years ago, it was food sensitivity testing, right? Everyone was doing this, sending in their hair, a spot of their blood, their saliva for this test to then within a few business days tell them, okay, you're allergic to this 27 different foods. So I think that's an oversimplification. And now we're really finally undoing a lot of that damage of saying, that never meant that you were allergic or intolerant to those foods. Really, that test just tells you if you have leaky gut and food just got into your bloodstream. So when we're oversimplifying things or saying this A plus B always equals C, it doesn't allow for the nuance. And even though we all have similar, physiology, anatomy, we're all going to have a unique microbiome. So it doesn't really take that into account. So I think all of these fad diets that are just promising you the next quickest thing, whether it's cut out all whatever fat from your diet, cut out all carbohydrates from your diet, eat keto, eat carnivore, eat fruit only, eat vegetables only, and don't eat anything else. It really is not looking at the totality of how complex our bodies are, how complex our relationship with food is, and how that is going to impact how we tolerate, digest, and absorb a wide variety of different foods.
And if I had to say, even, I mean, in our field, like we understand stool testing can be
Mm.
helpful, but also when you're lacking the context of, there's been studies to show what we thought were dangerous viruses in cord blood, in umbilical cord blood, and also in the fetal development, and what we thought was a sterile environment, and that's where you have this blood this really cool complex blood barrier protecting the fetus. We're going, oh wow, there's E. coli in there, and there's, all these other really cool viruses that we thought were dangerous, but they're not harming the baby. What are they doing there? We're losing that, or a lot of people never had this understanding of this ecosystem. And as long as things are in balance, they're not going to do harm. As long as again, the rats are there, the coyotes are there, the mountain lions are there, they're not constantly attacking us, trying to kill us, right? But obviously, if you go in the middle of the night all by yourself out on a hike that there's bears and mountain lions and coyotes, you might get attacked, right? You're putting yourself in a bad position. And I think we as Americans, and many of us in first world countries, are doing the surgeries, are taking the medications, are not eating. We're putting ourselves in a bad situation and then getting mad at the fact that, man, we got attacked. We got parasite, we got E. coli point, we got, and we're mad at the microbes, not looking at the context, right? So in stool testing, we're going, oh my gosh, I saw on my stool test there's E.
H.
coli,
pylori.
H. pylori. So I started taking oil of oregano, and I researched online that this concentrated, even it could be herbal, this concentrated herb helps with H. pylori, not realizing we always have H. pylori. Everybody has H. pylori. Sometimes it could go up, but that
Or it's
doesn't mean,
virulent. You really only need to intervene if it's virulent
right.
and you have symptoms. So is it active? Do you have symptoms? If not, you see it on a test, and if you're unsure how to interpret that test, you're going to try to intervene and overzealously intervene a lot of the times.
Which then can cause even more damage. And you're like, oh my God. So it's
Mhm.
really, yeah, that's a big one. I would say those are the two big ones we see. Yeah, for sure.
So I think it was with Dr. Pam Popper also that we were talking about the dangers of early detection, where when we're over,
Mm.
it's like cancer, and everyone has cancer happening in their body all the time, but a
Yeah,
healthy body is able to fight that off and prevent
correct.
thing. And if we do these early detections, it ultimately pulls people into the healthcare system that weren't really at risk of any sort of health issue. And now they're at risk of being negatively impacted by the healthcare system with doing all these tests and these procedures as they go any further. Do you see that based on what you were just saying with the viruses? Do you see that with regard to microbiome health and people doing these stool tests and that type of testing as well?
I'll let you speak on that. Yeah.
I wouldn't say stool tests per se are going to give you any of that information, but we have things like the Cologuard, which is a different type of stool test. So outside of a functional stool test, you have a Cologuard. And there's conflicting opinions on whether colonoscopies are beneficial or not. We're big proponents for colonoscopies. I believe colonoscopies save lives. But the Cologuard has a 13% false positive rate. And so, if you are receiving this information that, yes, you do have cancer cells detected in the Cologuard, one, that's going to ring bells of alarm, and you're going to create then stress, which can then stress out your gut bugs, and maybe overzealously intervene once again. So, I think it's important for people to reconnect with their bodies. If something seems off, if you're having rectal bleeding, if you're having abdominal distension and pain that can't be explained, then that's a sign that a colonoscopy can be helpful. Or, if you've reached the age of 45, it is recommended that you do get a colonoscopy, because colon cancer is the #1 fastest rising cancer, especially from the ages of 20 to 50. And so if we can detect it, if we can get some eyes in there and really see, hey, you have a precancerous polyp, you have a cancerous polyp, that can be easily removed before it can metastasize and before it can move to other areas of the body. So yeah, I would say I'm not a huge fan of Cologuard in general, because I think then people get overconfident in them. I've also had other people tell me I did a Cologuard stool test and it said I was great, no cancer cells detected, and I ended up having stage 4 colon cancer after that. So yeah, I think again, it's one of those things where it's like you're trying to circumvent something that's been proven to be real and really helpful. So I know it's not a popular opinion. I know that that's not what some of these other plant-based docs believe either, but I've worked in a gastroenterology office. I've seen the most plant-based people have colon cancer because they were afraid to get a colonoscopy.
And if I could give some context to that, since we're on that subject, a very, very important subject, which what we do know from studies is that you could be born, I mean, vaginally, do everything right. Maybe you didn't have antibiotics and you're plant-based from birth and you're eating tons of plants and diversity, all the probiotics. You could do everything right, but there are studies to show, we know this, there are transgenerational effects. So you are not just getting your own microbiome, your microbiome is an inheritance. We can think of it like that. And just like some of us are very blessed with an inheritance, many of us are like, wow, I come from a very wealthy family. Others, and there's a whole spectrum, right? The very wealthy to I received nothing from my parents, right? Or I didn't have that inheritance. The same is true for the microbiome, right? If your mother had IBS or Crohn's or other GI issues, you are more likely to have that because your mother is giving you her microbiome. And the same is true for your grandmother, your great grandmother, and the lineage continues, right? So you could do everything right, but that transgenerational effect is there. We even know this happens via the microbiome from pesticide exposure. So we had a whole generation of DDT is good for me. And then you go to the following generation where we're seeing now a rise in IBD, IBS, and now colon cancer. And we're like, what the heck's going on? Well, we had that transgenerational effect on top of, I mean, those of us born in the 80s and 90s, I mean, antibiotics were just given out like Pez candy, right? I mean, it was just what you did at the doctor's office. So you have to understand that context, like that does have ripple effects. So it's important if you're feeling like I'm doing everything right, but you're having those symptoms, just like what Dahlia said, you're having those symptoms, you're not feeling quite right, something's off. It makes sense to get it thoroughly checked, right? That's when it truly does make sense. And you should definitely do that and not just kind of guess or not just rely on the fact like, but I'm doing everything right. So I couldn't have anything possibly wrong with me. It's like, we have to humble ourselves a little bit and be like, it's better to just, make sure or connect with someone who knows what they're doing to conservatively check and not just kind of throw, because there is that opposite where you can see a functional doctor and they throw everything at you and you're just even more overwhelmed. But
And I always say, because like I said, we worked in a gastroenterology office with a plant-based gastroenterologist. So, people would always come to us and say, I don't want to get a colonoscopy and I'm plant-based. I should be good. I'm eating the fiber. And it's asking like, have you always been plant-based? If you were on a standard American diet for 40 years and you've been plant-based for 3 years, that's not always enough to undo what could have been there. So, for that reason, I think that it is just important to guess, not guess, but check, test, and not guess. I know Dr. Khan's a big fan of test, not guess as well. And, in our field, we are huge proponents of that.
So, obviously when we're born with our DNA and our bodies proceed from there, but the bacteria is outside of our DNA, right? How do we end up with our microbiome then?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, so there's evidence now, there's some really cool studies to show that there is some intracellular microbial activity, which is really cool. For the most part, I think we're going to find out in studies that we think of newborn babies as these sterile new specimens, and that's not really the case. Just like we're seeing, oh, there's viruses in the placenta. Oops, we were telling everyone there wasn't. And so I think it's one of those things like what it was like, lack of evidence is not evidence of lack, right? And I think we're slowly finding out like, oh, these babies aren't quite as sterile as we thought, right? So it's like, first and foremost, I think our microbiome is always there. That's at least I would say my thesis and understanding of it right now. So really the mom is just enhancing that, almost kind of like as a preemptive or precursor to be like, welcome to the world. Now you're fully in this microbial rich world, right? So I think it's, yeah, to answer your question in a short way, I think it's always there and it's just enhanced by what we do. So a really cool area of research is called the exposome. That is called the exposome, what you're saying, which is now our outside exposure and how that's affecting what's already inside of us. That is the exposome research, where it's everything. Who's your roommate? Who's your spouse? What are you eating, drinking, exposed to? You name it. That is the exposome.
And then we also have nutrigenomics, where what we eat is going
Yeah.
to interact with our microbes and build that microbiome. But there's very strong data to support the first 1,000 days of life for really kind of setting the foundation for what's going on in our gut. And that is including in utero. So when our moms are pregnant with us, they can influence our gut microbiome. If your mother has inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, very inflamed microbiome, that will kind of also pass on to the baby. But then we know that from delivery, right, whether you're birthed vaginally or via C-section, that will influence your microbiome one way or the other. If you're breastfed or formula fed, if you had colic or not, that will influence your microbiome. If you had allergies or intolerances, right, there are a lot of babies with, even though they're born with the enzymes to break down lactose intolerance from the very beginning. So from, conception, that baby's microbiome is really starting to lay its foundation.
But ultimately, even in vitro, would that microbiome be coming from the mother, just from inside the body before they pass through the vaginal canal, before they receive the colostrum from the mother during breastfeeding? But it
Yeah.
ultimately comes from the mother.
We do
Ultimately.
see absolutely that contributes quite a bit to the microbiome. There's other things that will impact it, but mom's microbiome can also communicate and kind of send the very first signals to that baby's developing microbiome, especially in the last few months of pregnancy when the microbiome is really emerging.
But what's funny, where it gets complex, is there's studies to go. So for example, let's say mom came from a very healthy family, but mom meets an unhealthy partner who, right? So mom's family was eating organic and grew up on a farm, a regenerative organic farm or whatever. And she meets a partner from the city who eats hot dogs and, processed food. And so we do know who you live with, who you cohabitate with. Even in a relatively short amount of time, your microbiome will start to resemble who you're cohabitating with more than your own family. So it's very interesting that it also, that's where the male counterpart is having an effect, where their microbiome and the environment that they maybe take mom into or move mom into has a big effect. So yes, mom is creating the baby's microbiome, but where they are, who they're with, also has that effect as well. And we've seen that in studies. So it's quite complex. Yeah, many dominoes and moving parts for sure.
Yeah, as we go along, I'm just like writing down questions, and it's, to use your river analogy, it's like I'm like, do I go down this part? There's just
Yeah, which pathway are you choosing?
and I think, even, still for a lot of people, it's still a relatively new subject. So I'm trying to get to the heart of things, like with regard to breastfeeding and the colostrum. And my understanding is, with breastfeeding, that milk has a large constituent of a disaccharide that's undigestible by the baby, and it's figure out why is the milk made up of so much material that the baby can't digest. Can you talk about that?
HMOs.
Yeah.
So human milk oligosaccharides is a fairly like newer finding of like, whoa, what are these HMOs? And we're not talking about insurance HMO. It's human milk oligosaccharides. These are these special polysaccharides that are carbohydrate chains that are not digested. And you're like, well, isn't that going to hurt the baby? Or like, what's going on? And it's like, guess who's eating those? The baby's microbiome, right? You are essentially it's essentially like feed them and they will come, right? You're like getting a party ready, right? And you're setting everything up, putting out all the food, and you're like, all right, microbes, come and eat, right? And so you're getting that in breast milk. And what's even cooler with breast milk is over time, and as humans, for the most part, we understand that anthropologically we can breastfeed up to the age of 5, you know, and some cultures we see this in more like third world where there's more scarcity. Babies, if possible, can breastfeed up to 6. We've seen that on an average from the last several hundred years. So it's really interesting to see that because breast milk will change over time as the baby develops. And just another cool thing with breastfeeding is as the baby is feeding, the mother's nipple is analyzing baby's saliva. And it's taking baby's DNA, analyzing what's going on in the baby to then alter the milk if necessary. So it's
create more immunoglobulins, support
insane.
baby's immune system. But yeah, with those HMOs, we know not only are they increasing populations and richness of the microbes in the gut, they also have been shown in studies to help with the gut barrier. So that helps to strengthen babies' developing gut barrier, make it more strong. That will decrease babies' risk of allergies and food intolerances. They have been shown to be beneficial for brain development. They can bind to pathogens, so they can help protect baby from them. So these human milk oligosaccharides are so incredible, so important. I think they're trying to mimic them in formula, but we're seeing that they are functioning in not exactly the same way. So if someone's able to breastfeed, breastfeeding is so important, especially in those first 1,000 days of life. So about the first 2 years of the baby's life.
And while antibiotics was a major discovery that saved so many lives, can you talk about the negative impact for the way that we use antibiotics today on the microbiome?
Absolutely. So we are finding that it can take up to 3 months to really recover the microbiome after one single course of antibiotics. And for some people, that can even take longer. And so they're not just targeting that one bug, that one pathogen, that one bacteria that is maybe causing problems and causing symptoms. They're going to even target the healthy helpers. They're going to target everyone. So there are so many diseases and so many conditions that have been associated to antibiotic, especially antibiotic overuse. So we see rates of inflammatory bowel disease increase with that. That's one of the major contributing factors for developing inflammatory bowel disease. Also irritable bowel syndrome. Again, allergies we see increase with antibiotic use. We do tend to see also a link with just all those other diseases that kind of flourish out from the gut because it is causing that imbalance. So with antibiotics, it's always asking, do I absolutely need this? What will happen if I don't take this antibiotic? What's an alternative? You know, especially if it's for something localized. You know, for example, if you have a sinus infection, you can ask, is there some type of wash that I can use that I can rinse my sinus cavity with rather than taking an oral broad spectrum antibiotic that will affect me from tip to toe? If it's something topical, asking, can I use a topical antimicrobial instead of orally ingesting something that's going to offset my gut microbiome? So we are seeing such increased disease risk with antibiotic overuse. And it's not just what we're consuming ourselves or what we're consenting to take. We do know we've tested certain things like our waterways, and sometimes water is contaminated with antibiotics because people will do things like flush their antibiotics down the toilet or from animal runoff. Animal products are a huge source of antibiotics for people as well. So if you're consuming animal products, you could be consuming the antibiotics that those animals were fed. You know, animal agriculture is the #1 consumer of antibiotics in our country as well. So it's really important for people to understand, even if you don't take antibiotics, you're probably interacting with them in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, if I could just say, yeah, the multi-billion-dollar annually antibiotic just in the US use, 80% of that is going to livestock. So so everyone's eating Chick-fil-A, or especially, you know, if you're getting that livestock through a fast food drive-through, you are likely getting the most antibiotic rich meat that you can get, because that's where most of our antibiotics are going to, creating antibiotic resistant microbes, which then require more antibiotics if you do acquire an antibiotic resistant strain. So yeah, that's a whole other, that can be a whole talk for an hour for sure.
That's what I feel like. They say time flies when you're having fun, and
Yeah.
it's fine. I've got so many questions for you. I do want to ask you a question, but I'm going to put two together because I want to make sure that you get to it before we end in less than 10 minutes. One, besides stop eating, the fast food with all the antibiotics in it, if you're taking a course of antibiotics, what's the best way to recover it in a healthy way and quickly? And then I want you to tell everybody, because it is in the title of the panel, what is SIBO and what is IBS and how do people get it and how do people resolve it?
We'll try to wrap it in an
We'll
easy
rapid
way.
fire. So
Yeah.
if you take antibiotics,
10 minutes.
yes,
So yours.
eat lots of fiber and eat probiotic rich foods. We used to recommend taking a probiotic while you were taking antibiotics. And they did a study a few years ago that actually found those who did that took longer to recover their natural microbiome. So don't necessarily take a probiotic at the same time that you're taking an antibiotic, but eat small amounts of probiotics in these foods that also come with the food for them, the prebiotic fiber. And then, if you're having issues after following an antibiotic course, you can definitely consider taking a probiotic at that time to re-inoculate your gut. I don't know if you have anything to add to
And
that.
just an analogy I think is great because we all have native species. So we're all unique ecosystems. So the reason why, at least in theory, is that when you're adding that probiotic, those might be species that your gut really isn't used to in that abundance. So now on top of you trying to recover from the antibiotics, you're throwing in these non-native species that are now competing with the species that were already there in your gut. So now they're getting a double whammy. And that's a theory of why this takes longer. Think of it like an empty plot of land in Alaska versus an empty plot of land in Mexico. You're going to see different wildflowers, different things grow, even if you just leave that land alone, versus if you go there and try to force your own flowers to grow. It's totally different ecosystems. So to think you can put the same flowers there, why not just let its own native ecosystem grow back? That's the quick analogy with that. SIBO and IBS. So IBS is irritable bowel syndrome. SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth.
And we know all SIBO is a form of irritable bowel syndrome. And irritable bowel syndrome really means that you have any change in gas, bloating, abdominal pain or discomfort, or stool multiple times a month. And so if that's happening, you will receive that diagnosis of IBS. And it's called a diagnosis of exclusion because first they're going to rule out celiac disease, inflammatory bowel disease. They're going to rule out anything major going on, colon cancer. And if they scope you and blood test you and there's nothing there, they'll say, I don't know, your bowel is just irritable. But we expect people to go a little bit further. So now we know 14 to 70% of irritable bowel syndrome is small intestinal bacterial or microbial overgrowth. And that's just when the bugs are out of balance. Certain bugs will create certain gases, and that can cause symptoms like diarrhea, constipation, alternating diarrhea, constipation, urgency, and pain. And so that's really when your small and large intestines could be just out of complete balance. They're not in that beautiful eubiosis we want. They're in dysbiosis.
Okay, perfect. And what are your thoughts on, well, actually, let me go with this. How do you treat that? How do you treat both of them?
Yeah, good question. One, it's identifying, do you have it? So breath testing is kind of the gold standard for detecting it. And, we do in our practice a Trio Smart breath test because it looks at all 3 types of SIBO. So it will help us identify which type do you have, because then we can understand which bugs you probably have. And then we can create certain treatments for that. So antimicrobials are something that people can use. They have created certain antibiotics that really will just target, for example, E. coli will create hydrogen SIBO. So they do have antibiotics that are not broad spectrum. They're just absorbed in the small intestine, and they will just target E. coli and Klebsiella, 2 bugs that make hydrogen gas. Or maybe if you have hydrogen sulfide SIBO, you've added a binder like bismuth to it. So first it's testing, then knowing what you have and how much of it that you have and getting back into balance. Then you want to recover your motility, and then your gut barrier.
And so what I'll say is that's where you can go to a gastro, and there are more and more gastros that can identify and give you an antibiotic. but really that's kind of where it ends for a lot of people. We take it a step further. So what we find are patients coming to us going, I'm now on my third antibiotic course for SIBO, and it keeps coming back. So the second part to this, which is a very, very important piece, is the lifestyle change and nutrition. So that's what we've developed in our practice, which is going, hey, we're not only going to identify, properly treat, but we're also going to ask the whys. Why did this happen in the first place? Properly get your nutrition in line to repair the gut structure, function, and motility. That way, long term, you're able to add back as many foods as possible, bring back your native diversity, and never, hopefully, never have to deal with this again. Versus the alternate route, which is like just continue on course after course of antibiotic or go on such a strict elimination diet that you never come back for it or from it. That's essentially what we're seeing with this carnivore movement. I think it's a lot of people who are having gut issues. They've eliminated, and now they're just stuck eating, I can only eat eggs, butter, and different forms of meat. Otherwise, I feel bloated, gassy, I don't feel well. It's essentially they've dug themselves in a hole so deep that they can no longer see the light. And they're just like, this is my lifestyle, and I'm going to build a brand around it, right? Where it's like, yeah, there's more to that story for sure.
So if I can understand what you're saying with regard to the elimination diet leading to eating meat, they haven't really figured out what the bacterial balance is and the issue that they're having. So they're starving all of the bacteria fiber and their food. So they're only eating they're eating meat, which doesn't really feed the bacteria, so they don't get the symptoms that they're having with the bad bacteria. Is that?
Yeah. It's not fermentable like fibers are. So these microbes aren't then creating the byproduct, because if they're not really feeding off of something, they're kind of putrefying the meat, and if anything, but they're not really fermenting it, because then they can't extract nutrients from it. Then they can't create their postbiotics from it. So that is why diets like that will be helpful.
What was the name of the test that you said?
A Trio Smart test. And that's
The
something,
test or something. It sounded like you
it's,
said. Okay.
yes,
What
a Trio Smart breath test. And we do offer that in our practice.
breath test? Like you're breathing? Okay.
You breathe into these bags. You just send them samples of your breath.
I'm going to ask you a yes and no question, although I'm sure you're going to want to add more to it, but I want to get to at least one of
Yes.
our participants. Fermented foods, yes or no?
Yes.
All
4
right.
to 6 a day.
All right. Very good. I'm going to throw it out to Janet M. Please ask your question, Janet.
Okay, yeah, I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about digestive enzymes? You think those are a good idea or not really? And also, like, how much water do you feel like people should be drinking for good digestion and also weight loss?
These are great questions. I think in the right context, yeah, digestive enzymes can be really helpful. So you want to ask yourself, do you have anything that's predisposing you to decreasing enzymes? So certain autoimmune conditions decrease saliva production, and they will then benefit from digestive enzymes because they're not making them there. Or if somebody has diabetes, type 1, type 2 diabetes, and their pancreas is overwhelmed, sometimes it's not making enough digestive enzymes. So a lot of my type 1 diabetics do need digestive enzymes. Someone has had SIBO or gut dysbiosis or leaky gut, we make a large percentage of enzymes as well in the lining of the small intestine. So someone like that also could benefit from taking a digestive enzyme. If you find benefit in the digestive enzyme, that's great. I always just encourage someone to really understand why it's helpful for them. So that way they know, how long do I need to be on this? Is this indefinite for me? Why did I get here? And, I'm glad that it's helping. And regarding water, I always say at least half of your body weight in pounds and ounces, to ensure that you're hydrating the fiber that you're consuming every day, and that your stool is well hydrated. Because if you're eating lots of starch and soluble fiber foods, you want to make sure that you have the proper water to hydrate them, so that way your body can properly break them down, digest them, and do what it needs to do with them.
All right. Well, I really wish we had more time. All these hands are going up. I got people messaging me with questions all of a sudden. Maybe we'll have to do a 3-hour panel one of these days. But
Yeah.
thank you so much for everything and all the information that you shared. And I think I made this joke the other day that you must be really fun at a dinner party, but I think you
I
probably
know.
are, actually.
think we are. I think, yeah.
We'll always
it could be
bring up
fun.
what will happen after the dinner party.
Yeah.
Great. I'm sure they love that.
Thank you for having us.
Our pleasure. If we could unmute the audience, please.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Great information.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.